They don't always step back because they don't care. Sometimes they step back because they care too much and don't trust themselves with what that care could do. And this is where most people misunderstand the entire situation. You feel the distance, and your heart starts writing a story. If they wanted me, they would show up. If I mattered, they would stay close. If this was real, I wouldn't feel this confusion. And those thoughts feel so logical in the moment that you start making decisions from pain instead of perspective. But there's another layer most people never stop to consider. Sometimes the very person who is pulling away is not doing it because they don't feel enough, but because they feel too much and don't know how to hold it without breaking something or being broken by it. So they create space, not because space is what they want long term, but because in that moment, it feels like the only way to stop themselves from repeating patterns they're afraid of repeating again. They remember their past mistakes. They remember who got hurt when they stayed too close without knowing how to love properly. And instead of trusting that they can do it differently this time, they retreat into what feels safe. Distance becomes their protection. But here's the truth that is hard to accept. Protection is not peace. And just because someone is protecting themselves doesn't mean they are at peace with the distance they created. Inside that distance, there is often conflict. A part of them misses you. A part of them wonders if they are sabotaging something meaningful. A part of them wants to reach out but doesn't trust what will happen if they do. So they stay still, frozen between desire and fear. And what makes this even more confusing is that avoidance can look like disinterest from the outside. It can look like they are fine without you. It can look like you didn't matter as much as you thought. But emotional withdrawal is not always emotional absence. Sometimes it is emotional overwhelm with no safe expression. So you are left in the silence, trying to interpret a language that was never clearly spoken. And here is where your power gets tested, because the natural reaction is to chase clarity from someone who is currently confused within themselves. But confusion cannot offer clarity. You cannot extract certainty from someone who is still negotiating with their own emotions. This is why your grounding matters. Not to punish them, not to prove a point, but to protect your own emotional stability while someone else is figuring out their internal world. Because love without self-respect turns into anxiety. And understanding without boundaries turns into self-abandonment. You can have compassion for someone's fear without letting their fear become the blueprint for your self-worth. You can understand that someone is pulling away because they are overwhelmed, while still acknowledging that you deserve consistency, presence, and emotional clarity. And this is the balance most people struggle to hold, because it requires you to see two truths at the same time. That someone can care about you deeply and still not be able to show up in the way you need. That is not a contradiction. That is human limitation. But here is the deeper invitation hidden inside this experience. You are being asked not just to understand them, but to understand yourself. Why do you stay in uncertainty longer than you should? Why does potential sometimes feel stronger than presence? Why does distance make you want to prove your worth instead of walking away from confusion? These are not questions to shame you. They are questions to wake you up. Because your emotional life is not meant to be built on decoding silence. It is meant to be built on clarity, reciprocity, and mutual willingness. And if someone is currently unable to meet you there, the lesson is not to chase harder or over-explain yourself until they finally see you. The lesson is to stop abandoning your own clarity for the hope that they will eventually find theirs. If they are meant to come closer, it will not be because you convinced them while they were distant. It will be because they did the inner work that made closeness feel safe again. And if they don't, you will still have something even more valuable than their return. Your self-respect intact, your emotional center stable, and your ability to choose relationships that don't require you to guess where you stand. Because real love does not leave you in confusion for long. It may have moments of fear, yes, but it does not make uncertainty its home. And when you finally understand that, you stop trying to interpret distance as destiny and start choosing presence as your standard. When someone has an avoidant pattern, what you are often looking at is not a lack of feeling, but a lack of emotional safety within themselves. And that distinction changes everything. Because when you misinterpret distance as disinterest, you start responding to the situation in a way that actually deepens the divide, instead of understanding what created it in the first place. Avoidant behavior is rarely born from a place of emotional emptiness. More often, it is born from emotional overload that was never properly processed, understood, or healed. At some point in their life, closeness became associated with pressure, expectation, disappointment, or even emotional pain. So now, when intimacy starts to grow again in their adult relationships, their nervous system does not register it as something safe and nurturing. It registers it as something intense, something that needs to be managed, something that could potentially lead to hurt, either their own or someone else's. So instead of leaning in, they pull back. But that pulling back is not a declaration of indifference. It is a reflex, a protective response, a learned survival strategy that says, if I create space, I reduce the chance of damage. And in their internal logic, space equals safety. The problem is that what feels safe in the short term often creates confusion and disconnection in the long term. Because while they are trying to regulate their internal world, the person on the receiving end is left trying to interpret silence, distance, and emotional withdrawal. And silence without explanation often gets filled with assumptions. Assumptions like I am not important, or they don't care, or I must have done something wrong. But what if none of that is actually true? What if the distance is not a reflection of your value, but a reflection of their internal struggle to stay emotionally regulated? Avoidant individuals often carry a deep, sometimes unconscious fear of being overwhelmed by emotion. Not just their own emotions, but the emotions that come with closeness, expectations, responsibility, vulnerability, and the possibility of disappointing someone they genuinely care about. So instead of risking that pressure building up, they choose distance as a pressure release valve. It is not that they do not want love. It is that love, in its real and present form, activates something inside them that feels harder to manage than distance does. And this is where the misunderstanding becomes painful. Because from the outside, their withdrawal looks like rejection. It looks like emotional withdrawal from the relationship itself. But internally, it is often withdrawal from their own discomfort, not from you. They may still think about you. They may still feel something for you. They may even miss you in moments of silence. But their coping strategy does not allow them to stay close while feeling that intensity. So they disconnect temporarily in order to regulate themselves. This is why you can sometimes see inconsistency. Moments of warmth followed by sudden distance. Presence followed by silence. It is not a clear message of I don't care. It is an unstable internal rhythm of I care, and I don't know how to hold what I feel without losing myself in it. And if you are unaware of this pattern, you will naturally take it personally. You will start adjusting yourself, trying to become more understandable, more available, more patient, hoping that consistency will eventually be rewarded with consistency from them. But the truth is, you cannot love someone out of a nervous system response they have not yet learned to regulate. Understanding this does not mean you excuse behavior that leaves you emotionally unfulfilled. It simply means you stop mislabeling it. Because when you label defense as disinterest, you end up reacting to the wrong problem. You chase clarity from someone who is not currently operating from clarity themselves. And that is where emotional exhaustion begins. The deeper truth is this: avoidance is not the absence of connection. It is the presence of fear wrapped around connection. And until that fear is understood and worked through by the person experiencing it, their behavior will continue to reflect protection more than expression. So when you see distance, instead of immediately concluding absence, you are being asked to develop discernment, not to justify inconsistency, but to understand its origin. Because only then can you make decisions from awareness instead of emotional reaction. Emotional distance is often misread as a lack of interest, but in many cases, it is actually a form of protection specifically. Protection from guilt, shame, and the fear of causing harm again. When someone has a pattern of avoidance, their internal world is not simply I don't care enough to stay close. It is often much more complicated and far more emotionally loaded than that. At the core of this behavior is a memory, sometimes conscious, often unconscious, of past emotional situations where closeness led to pain. Maybe they hurt someone they loved. Maybe they felt responsible for someone else's emotional breakdown. Maybe they stayed too long in something they didn't understand how to handle, and the aftermath left them with regret. And so now, when they feel emotional intensity rising again, their instinct is not to lean in and try harder. Their instinct is to step back before history repeats itself. But here is the subtle truth. They are not always stepping back because they don't want you. They are stepping back because they don't want to repeat what they believe they are capable of repeating when they feel emotionally overwhelmed. In their mind, distance becomes a moral safeguard. It is their way of saying, if I stay too close, I might mess this up again. If I get too involved, I might hurt them without meaning to. If I allow myself to fully engage, I might lose control of how I show up emotionally. So rather than testing their ability to handle closeness differently this time, they default to what feels safer: withdrawal. And that withdrawal is not empty. It is not emotionally neutral. It is often filled with internal tension. Because while one part of them is stepping away to prevent harm, another part is still emotionally attached, still thinking, still feeling, still conflicted about the decision to create space. This is why avoidant distance often carries emotional complexity rather than emotional clarity. It is not a clean break. It is not a clear rejection. It is a conflicted retreat. From the outside, however, what you experience is silence, less communication, less initiation, less emotional availability. And naturally, the human mind fills that silence with meaning. You start asking yourself, if they cared, why would they pull away like this? And that question feels logical because you are interpreting behavior through the lens of emotional expression. But their behavior is not purely expressive. It is protective. And protection does not always look like love, even when love is present underneath it. For someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional closeness can feel like responsibility increasing. The closer someone gets, the more they feel expected to show up consistently, to respond correctly, to not disappoint. And if they already carry an internal belief that they have disappointed people in the past, then closeness does not feel like comfort, it feels like pressure building. So instead of risking that pressure reaching a point where they might fail again, they create distance early. Not because they want to lose you, but because they are trying to avoid becoming someone they don't want to be in the relationship. This is where the emotional contradiction lives, because while they are pulling away to avoid hurting you, the act of pulling away can itself create confusion and emotional pain for you. And that outcome is often something they did not intend, but indirectly repeat. The tragedy is that their method of protection becomes the very thing that creates the disconnection they were trying to prevent. But in their internal logic, they believe distance is still the lesser harm compared to staying close and potentially failing emotionally. So they choose what feels like the responsible option in their mind: stepping back. And because this decision is rooted in fear rather than clarity, it does not always feel peaceful to them either. There is often inner conflict, moments of missing the connection, moments of questioning whether they are making the right choice, moments where they feel the pull to return, but cannot fully trust themselves to stay consistent if they do. So they remain in that middle space, emotionally engaged enough to care, but distanced enough to feel safe. Understanding this does not mean you ignore the impact it has on you. It does not mean you normalize inconsistency or accept emotional uncertainty as a permanent state, but it does mean you stop interpreting every act of distance as proof of emotional absence. Because sometimes the distance is not a statement about your worth or their feelings. It is a reflection of their attempt to prevent pain in a way that is clumsy, fear-driven, and internally conflicted. Many avoidant individuals don't experience closeness as something purely romantic or emotionally comforting. Instead, somewhere deep in their internal conditioning, closeness becomes linked with responsibility. And responsibility, in their emotional language, is not always experienced as love. It is often experienced as pressure. This connection between intimacy and responsibility is one of the core reasons they struggle to remain consistently emotionally available, even when they do care. When emotional closeness starts to build, it naturally brings expectations with it. Not necessarily spoken expectations, but implied ones. Being present more often, responding in a certain way, showing emotional consistency, being reliable when the other person is vulnerable. For someone with a secure emotional foundation, these expectations feel natural, even fulfilling. But for someone with an avoidant pattern, these expectations can feel heavy, almost like invisible weight being placed on their shoulders. And this is where the internal interpretation shifts. Instead of closeness being experienced as "I feel safe with you," it begins to feel like "now I have to be careful not to mess this up." That subtle shift changes the entire emotional experience. Because now they are not just relating to you as a person, they are also managing an internal fear of failing you. And that fear of failure is not small. It is often tied to identity. Many avoidant individuals carry a quiet belief that if they stay too close for too long, they will eventually disappoint the people they care about. Maybe they believe they are inconsistent. Maybe they believe they are emotionally unpredictable. Maybe they believe that when pressure builds, they withdraw or shut down. So instead of risking that pattern being repeated, they try to control the situation by limiting closeness itself. In their mind, The logic becomes simple. Less closeness equals less responsibility, and less responsibility equals less chance of failure. But what gets missed in that logic is that emotional connection cannot be maintained at a distance without consequences. So while they are trying to protect the relationship from their perceived limitations, they are simultaneously creating emotional distance that can be felt very strongly by the other person. This is where misunderstanding often begins, because the partner on the receiving end doesn't see "I'm afraid of responsibility." They see inconsistency. They see emotional withdrawal. They see someone who was present and warm now becoming distant and unavailable. And naturally, they interpret that as loss of interest or emotional disengagement. But internally, it is often the opposite dynamic playing out. The more they feel something meaningful forming, the more they become aware of the stakes. And the higher the stakes feel, the more pressure they feel to get it right. But instead of leaning into growth and learning how to hold that responsibility differently, they revert to what has historically helped them cope, stepping back. It is important to understand that for them, responsibility in emotional intimacy is not just about showing up, it is about not failing someone they care about. And if their past experiences taught them that emotional closeness eventually leads to disappointment or conflict, then responsibility becomes emotionally charged. It is no longer just a relational role, it becomes a risk. So when they start to feel like someone is depending on them emotionally, even in healthy ways, their nervous system can interpret that as pressure building. And pressure is what they associate with eventual emotional collapse or withdrawal. So they try to prevent that collapse by distancing early, before things feel too involved. The irony is that this attempt to reduce responsibility often leads to a situation where responsibility is still present, but in a different form. Now they are responsible for explaining their distance, or avoiding emotional conversations, or managing guilt for not being as available as they once were. So the escape from responsibility is never completed, just changes shape. And beneath all of this, there is often a desire that is not fully expressed. A desire to be close without feeling overwhelmed. To love without feeling burdened. To care without feeling like they are one mistake away from hurting someone. But because they have not yet developed the emotional tools to separate intimacy from pressure, they default to reducing intimacy itself. This is why their behavior can feel confusing. Because it is not driven by a lack of care, it is driven by a struggle to carry care without associating it with emotional risk. When someone with avoidant tendencies feels emotionally overwhelmed, their response is often not expression but control. And one of the most immediate ways they try to regain control is by creating distance. It is not always a conscious decision in the moment, like "I will pull away now." It is often a nervous system reaction that says, "This is too much right now. I need space to feel stable again." To understand this, you have to understand what overwhelm actually means in their internal experience. It is not just about having strong emotions. It is about having emotions that feel unmanageable, uncontained, or too demanding at once. Emotional closeness can bring warmth, connection, attraction, and vulnerability all at the same time. For someone who has not learned how to sit comfortably in that emotional intensity, it can feel like being emotionally flooded. And when the system feels flooded, it naturally seeks relief. So they step back. But what they are actually trying to do in that moment is not reject the relationship. They are trying to regulate themselves. Distance becomes a tool for emotional stabilization. It is their way of lowering the intensity so their internal world can return to a level where they feel in control again. From the outside, this can be extremely confusing because you may experience a moment of connection, openness, or emotional closeness, and then suddenly notice a shift, less communication, less emotional engagement, a noticeable withdrawal that feels almost like a switch has been flipped. And without understanding the internal mechanism behind it, that shift can easily be interpreted as rejection or loss of interest. But internally, what has often happened is a threshold has been crossed. Something in the emotional exchange has moved from manageable to too much. And once that threshold is crossed, their instinct is not to process it through deeper communication, but to step away from it until it settles. This is because many avoidant individuals were not taught how to stay present in emotional intensity without losing their sense of self. So instead of learning to regulate within connection, they learn to regulate through separation. Alone becomes the place where they feel they can think clearly again, breathe again, and regain their emotional balance. So when they pull away, they are often not thinking, "I don't care anymore." They are thinking, "I need to feel like myself again." because in moments of emotional overwhelm, they can lose access to their grounded state. Everything can feel amplified: expectations, emotions, perceived demands, even their own internal reactions. And in that state, connection feels less like comfort and more like pressure. The interesting part is that the distance they create does not always bring immediate relief in the emotional sense. It brings relief in the nervous system sense. It reduces stimulation. It reduces emotional demand. It reduces the feeling of being pulled in multiple directions at once. So even if they still care, even if they still think about the person, the reduced intensity gives them a temporary sense of stability. But because this becomes a learned pattern, it can start to repeat automatically. Emotional closeness leads to overwhelm. Overwhelm leads to distance. Distance leads to temporary relief. And over time, this cycle becomes their default way of handling intimacy. What makes this especially complex is that the distance can unintentionally create more emotional intensity for the other person. While one person is trying to reduce emotional stimulation, the other person is often experiencing increased emotional uncertainty. So both sides are reacting to intensity in opposite ways, one by withdrawing from it, the other by trying to resolve it. And this is where misalignment grows. Because what could have been a moment of emotional processing together becomes a separation where one person is regulating alone, and the other is left trying to interpret what changed. It is also important to recognize that this distancing is not always fully satisfying for them either. It may calm the immediate overwhelm, but it does not resolve the underlying emotional connection. So there can be lingering thoughts, emotional echoes, and internal conflict even in the space they created. They may feel clearer, but not necessarily fully at peace. Yet because they associate closeness with losing that clarity, they continue to choose distance as the safer option in moments of intensity. So what looks like emotional withdrawal from the outside is often, internally, an attempt to restore balance. Not an exit from connection, but a retreat from emotional overload that they have not yet learned how to navigate while staying present. Silence and emotional withdrawal are often interpreted as emptiness, as if nothing is happening inside the other person. But in reality, for many avoidant individuals, silence is not a sign of absence, it is a sign of internal congestion. It is what happens when emotional experiences become too complex, too intense, or too conflicting to be expressed in real time. From the outside, you see less communication, fewer messages, less emotional engagement, maybe delayed replies, short responses, or complete periods of distance. And because human beings naturally interpret communication as connection, the absence of it feels like emotional disappearance. You start thinking, if they cared, they would say something. If I mattered, they wouldn't go quiet like this. But internally, silence is rarely empty. It is often full of thoughts that are not yet organized, full of emotions that are not yet understood, full of conflict between what they feel and what they think they should do. An avoidant individual can genuinely care about someone and still struggle to translate that care into consistent emotional expression, especially when they are overwhelmed or uncertain. So instead of speaking, they pause. And that pause is not always a rejection. It is often a processing state, a mental and emotional holding pattern where they are trying to make sense of what they are feeling without triggering further emotional escalation. One of the core dynamics here is internal contradiction. They may feel closeness and warmth on one hand, and fear or pressure on the other. They may miss you, but also feel overwhelmed by the intensity of that missing. They may want connection, but also feel uncertain about how to maintain it without losing emotional balance. And when these opposing forces are active at the same time, expression becomes difficult, because expression requires clarity, and clarity requires emotional regulation. So instead of speaking from a place of confusion, they often choose not to speak at all. This is where silence becomes a protective space. Not necessarily protective of the relationship, but protective of their internal state. In silence, there is no immediate demand to respond correctly. No immediate pressure to explain feelings that are still shifting. No risk of saying the wrong thing and causing more emotional complexity. But the important thing to understand is that silence does not mean the absence of feeling. It often means the presence of feelings that are not yet organized into language. This is why avoidant withdrawal can feel so confusing to the other person. Because there is no clear communication of I need space because I feel overwhelmed, or I care about you but I'm struggling internally. Instead, there is just distance. And human beings are wired to fill gaps in communication with interpretation. So silence quickly becomes a blank screen where fears, doubts, and assumptions get projected. You start filling that silence with meaning. They don't care anymore. I was never that important. Something must have changed. But those interpretations are often responses to uncertainty, not accurate reflections of internal reality. Inside the avoidant experience, silence can also be a form of emotional self-protection from escalation. If they feel that their emotional state is unstable, they may avoid communication because they fear it will lead to saying something they don't fully mean, or reacting in a way that feels out of alignment later. So silence becomes a way to prevent emotional mistakes. There is also another layer. Emotional overload can make articulation feel exhausting. When someone is already mentally and emotionally saturated, even simple conversations can feel like too much. Not because the person is unimportant, but because the system is already full. In that state, responding can feel like adding more weight to an already overloaded internal space. So instead of engaging, they retreat into quiet. Not because nothing is happening, but because too much is happening at once. And while silence may feel like distance to you, internally it can be a space of reflection, conflict resolution, or emotional stabilization. They may be replaying conversations, questioning their own reactions, or trying to understand what they actually feel versus what they fear. The complexity is that this internal process is invisible to you. You only see the absence of communication, not the internal effort behind it. So naturally, it feels one-sided. It feels like disconnection. It feels like being left without explanation. But silence in avoidant patterns is rarely a statement of emotional absence. It is more often a state of emotional sorting, a temporary retreat into internal processing because external expression feels too uncertain, too intense, or too risky in that moment. And unless both people understand this dynamic, silence will always be misread as conclusion, when in reality it is often just transition. Avoidant behavior is very often rooted in emotional experiences that were never fully healed, processed, or understood. When someone carries unresolved emotional wounds, especially from past relationships or early attachment experiences, those wounds don't disappear just because time has passed. Instead, they quietly shape how that person experiences closeness, trust, vulnerability, and emotional responsibility in the present. What makes this particularly important to understand is that healing is not just about remembering what happened, it is about what the nervous system learned from what happened. If in the past, emotional closeness was followed by disappointment, inconsistency, abandonment, conflict, or emotional overwhelm, then the mind and body begin to build associations. And one of the strongest associations that can form is this: closeness equals emotional risk. So even when love is present in the present moment, the body may still respond as if something unsafe is approaching. This is not a logical decision. It is an emotional imprint. And because it operates beneath conscious awareness, the person may not even fully understand why they start feeling uneasy when things get too emotionally close or too meaningful. This is where avoidance often begins to form, not as a personality flaw, but as a protective adaptation. If emotional closeness once led to pain, then emotional distance begins to feel like safety. And over time, the person learns that when they pull away, their internal system calms down. When they detach, they feel more in control. When they reduce emotional intensity, they feel less vulnerable to being hurt again. But the important layer here is that the original wound is still active underneath the behavior. It has not been resolved, it has been managed. So what you see in adult relationships is not just a reaction to the current situation, it is also a response to something older that has not yet been fully healed. This is why avoidant individuals can sometimes appear emotionally inconsistent. They may genuinely care, they may feel connection, and they may even desire closeness. But when emotional intimacy begins to activate those older wounds, the protective system kicks in. And that protective system often says, don't go too deep, don't rely too much, don't stay too exposed. Because at some point in their emotional history, staying open may have led to being hurt in ways that felt overwhelming or confusing. Maybe they were emotionally invalidated when they expressed needs. Maybe vulnerability was met with rejection. Maybe dependency led to disappointment. Or maybe they learned that relying on others emotionally is not safe because people can change, leave, or fail to show up. So instead of trusting that closeness can be safe now, the emotional system continues to operate as if the past could repeat at any moment. And this is where fear becomes intertwined with love. They may feel love, but they also feel fear of what love might demand. They may feel connection, but also fear of what happens if they fully step into it. Because to them, emotional closeness is not just about bonding, it is also about exposure. Exposure to expectations. Exposure to emotional responsibility. Exposure to the possibility of failing someone they care about or being failed again. So they manage that internal tension by stepping back. Not because the connection is meaningless, but because the connection activates unresolved emotional material that feels difficult to hold. This is also why simple reassurance is not always enough to resolve avoidant patterns. You can tell someone it's safe, but if their nervous system has learned the opposite through repeated experience, safety has to be felt, not just heard. And feeling safe requires time, consistency, and internal emotional reconditioning that only they can do for themselves. Until that healing happens, their behavior will often reflect a split experience. One part of them desires connection, while another part of them tries to protect them from the emotional risks they associate with it. And so they oscillate between approach and withdrawal, between connection and distance, between openness and self-protection. Not because they are playing games, but because two emotional realities are active at the same time. The present desire for love and the past memory of emotional pain. Understanding this does not mean you excuse behavior that leaves you feeling uncertain or unfulfilled. It simply means you stop simplifying it into they don't care, or they are emotionally unavailable by choice. Instead, you recognize that what you are seeing is often the surface expression of deeper emotional learning that has not yet been rewritten. And until that rewriting happens internally, avoidance remains less about the present relationship and more about the emotional history still living inside them. What most people miss in these dynamics is that avoidance is not just about the other person, it is also about internal belief systems that shape how closeness is perceived in the first place. At the core of avoidant patterns, there is often a deeply rooted belief about the self in relationships. Something subtle, something unspoken, but something powerful enough to thank you for being here and allowing space for deeper understanding and reflection. Goodbye, and may you move forward with clarity, peace, and emotional strength in your heart.